Diabetes Connections is brought to you by One Drop, created for people with diabetes by people who have diabetes. By Real Good Foods, real food you feel good about eating. And by Dexcom. Take control of your diabetes and live life to the fullest with Dexcom.
This is Diabetes Connections with Stacey Simms.
This week, what is monogenetic diabetes and why should we, on a mainly type 1 diabetes podcast, care about it? Because the majority of people with monogenetic are misdiagnosed. People like Kristin Skiados, who thought she was living with type 1 for 38 years.
It really was a phone call that was the answers to a new life. And it was probably the first time that I was speechless on the phone. And the fact that this meant there was a possibility to not be on insulin was just amazing.
Kristin's daughter was also misdiagnosed. We'll talk about how this could happen, what it means for the rest of us, and what monogenetic, or MODY, is all about. In Tell Me Something Good, how a little sister's diagnosis changed a sibling's outlook and career plans. And what the heck is a diabetes merit badge? I got 'em. This podcast is not intended as medical advice. If you have those kinds of questions, please contact your healthcare provider. Welcome to another week of the show. I am so glad to have you along. Here on Diabetes Connections, we aim to educate and inspire about type 1 diabetes by sharing stories of connection. I'm your host, Stacey Simms. My son was diagnosed 13 years ago, right before he turned 2. I don't have diabetes. I do have a background in broadcasting, and that is how you get the podcast. Hello to any new people joining us from the Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina area. As this podcast is airing, I am just back from the JDRF Type 1 Nation Summit in that area and thrilled to meet many new people and see some familiar faces. Not too long a trip for me. Of course, I'm in the Charlotte, North Carolina area, but always fun to go to those conferences, see people in person, talk about the show, talk about the book, The World's Worst Diabetes Mom, and make those connections that I care so much about. And this is the second time that I have taken the diabetes merit badges on the road. I am so excited about this idea. This came to me, I guess it's one of those ideas that came kind of suddenly, but then was also years in the making. I have always thought that we deserve like a gold sticker or a huzzah, hooray, when something goes right in diabetes land. You know, there used to be a joke in the community that when your meter read 100, that confetti should come out of it, stuff like that. But when I was writing The World's Worst Diabetes Mom, I even mentioned in one of the chapters when I talk about the first injection I gave Benny at home, that I really felt like I had done something monumental and I wanted to, shout it to the world. And that's how the Nighttime Ninja sticker was born. So they are kind of silly. Yes, there is one that is a Nighttime Ninja. These are actual stickers. When I say merit badge, I mean these are stickers that you can buy. Things like Date Night Diva, which means you had a conversation without checking your CGM data 1,000 times. Hold Music Marathoner, finally spoke to a supply company representative. Dia Diplomat, calmly explained that sugar doesn't cause diabetes. Insurance Hoop Jumper, and on and on. A lot of these are geared to diabetes parents, which is obviously my perspective. But I teamed up with Rachel at Diabetes, who's a previous guest of the show and very popular in the community for her amazing T-shirts and her great Etsy store. So I'm going to link up in the episode homepage and on social media more about these stickers. You can buy them in batches. I also have a sticker that's not in the Etsy store yet, and it is Wanted for Not Waiting. It's the DIY Cowboy sticker, because that is for my friends at Night Scout and all of you who are not waiting. We're going to do something fun with that, maybe a fundraiser for them. We're still working out the details. As I said, this came on kind of quickly. I decided in December that this might be a really fun idea, and I called Rachel, and she was like, yes, I'm in. And I gave her a bunch of the ideas, and she came up with a couple of them herself. And then she's a genius when it comes to the pictures and the drawings, and it really came together beautifully. So right now, there will be a link in the episode homepage Diabetes Etsy store is the only place you can buy the stickers right now. And I have them on my book tour. And Rachel, as she goes out and about to conferences, she will have them as well. I'm really excited about them. They're very funny and silly and just a little bit of a pick-me-up. And if you have ideas for these as you see them, you can see all of them in her Etsy store, let us know. We will definitely add as we go if they're popular and people really want them. Love to hear what you have to say. On this interview, on this episode, a quick note. This interview is longer than usual, but it is a very complex, frankly, and a very interesting subject, and I didn't want to stop talking about it. So I'm doing something a little different for this episode. We're going to do about half the interview. Then we'll go into our Tell Me Something Good segment, and then I'm going to pick the interview back up. You can always listen to episodes on your own schedule, of course, but I just felt this was a really nice way to lay this episode out with an interview that by itself is more than 45 minutes. Regardless, the whole thing will be transcribed on the episode homepage. I am thrilled. People are loving the transcripts, so if you are one of them, please reach out and let me know. I'm so excited to finally be able to offer this. I know a lot of people wanted it. I'm thinking about trying to go back and do more episodes in the past. We shall see. All right, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Real Good Foods. High protein, low carb, real ingredients. Easy to find in a store near you. You can just go to the website, click on that store locator, type in your zip code. In our area, I can find them at Publix, Harris Teeter, and at Walmart. And if you'd like to order, their website is fantastic. Lots of great options. I mean, all of the options are on the website. Great breakfast sandwiches, grain-free, high in protein, low in carbs, because they use ingredients like cauliflower instead of processed flours or processed starches. So you don't get those weird sounding ingredients or weird preservatives. And you can find the list of ingredients right online. Very easy. All of the ingredients are on the website. Find out more. Go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Real Good Foods logo. My guests this week are here to talk about monogenetic diabetes, a type of diabetes caused by a genetic mutation. There are about 10 different types of diabetes that are genetic like this, and we are talking about a specific one today. These are all very rare. Together, they account for about 1% to 2% of all types of diabetes, but they are very often misdiagnosed and usually misdiagnosed as type 1. If you have monogenetic diabetes, you almost always don't need insulin. You take oral medication. So it is a big deal. Now, I have to admit, I struggled a little bit with this interview. I remember vividly researching when my son was diagnosed. I was so hoping that it would be monogenetic, MODY, or something else. And I struggle now because there's not an easy test for this. You can't just call your doctor and get a quick result. As you will hear, it is more complicated. So, as you will hear me ask, what are we supposed to do with this information, right? My guests are Kristin Skiados, who lived with type 1 for 38 years before genetic testing showed she didn't actually have it. And we'll hear briefly from her daughter, Ava, also misdiagnosed for years. And Dr. Toni Polen, a board-certified genetic counselor, a human geneticist, and she works with the Monogenetic Diabetes Research and Advocacy Project that is aiming to get universal access to diagnosis and individualized treatment. So here is my interview all about monogenetic diabetes. Dr. Polen and Kristin, thank you for talking to me. I am fascinated with this, and I'm so excited to learn more. Thanks for spending some time with me.
Well, thank you for having us.
Let me start with you, with Dr. Polen. Toni, let me just ask you, what are we talking about here? You know, we know there are different types of diabetes, but what is monogenetic?
So if you just kind of, break down monogenic, you have mono, which is one, and then genic, which is gene. What it means is that there's one gene that's really important in certain cases of diabetes. And we actually know that almost all diabetes is highly genetic. It has a lot of hereditary influence, so there are genes, there are variations in our DNA that we inherit from our parents that act in concert with other factors to determine whether or not we get diabetes and whether or not we get type 1 diabetes or type 2 diabetes, which even itself is a lot of different diseases. But for some cases of diabetes, the genetics is actually a lot simpler. There's some very specific change, like a misspelling in a gene that causes a person to have diabetes, makes them very, very likely to have diabetes, really explains most of it. So when we say monogenic, we mean that the cause of the diabetes can largely be explained by a change or a difference or a mutation in one single gene in that person.
And how is it treated?
How it's treated is it depends on the type. So it's going to sound a little bit contradictory because I just said monogenic, but there's actually several different forms because depending on the individual, there are several different possible genes that can be involved. But when an individual has monogenic diabetes, it's one gene. Again, that's explaining most of their diabetes. And so depending on the type of diabetes, the treatment will vary. So some types of monogenic diabetes, the diagnosis doesn't make that much of a difference. But the ones that we're most interested in, and actually the most common types, it does make a difference. So there's one type of monogenic, or one kind of group of types of monogenic diabetes called maturity onset diabetes of the young. And that sounds like a strange name, but that was an observation made in the 70s, 60s, 70s, even earlier, when it was realized that some children had diabetes that looked more like the type that older people got. They didn't need to be treated with insulin, and they actually, some of them responded really well to oral medications. And so getting back to your question, which is how is it treated, some people with certain kinds of monogenic diabetes sometimes these types are called MODY 3 and MODY 1, and they're caused by genes and changes in genes. And so sometimes we call them by their gene names, HNF1 alpha MODY and HNF4 alpha MODY or diabetes. And those are treated with low doses of a very old class of drugs called sulfonylureas. And these are drugs that help the pancreatic beta cells to make and release insulin.
Those medications, is that like metformin? Are these oral medications?
They are oral medications, but what's interesting is back when these types of diabetes were first discovered, when it was discovered that, you had these children who didn't quite fit either way. They were kids. They were part of the way and maybe part of why they called it maturity onset diabetes of the young is because they responded to the medication that was used in adult diabetes. Metformin did not exist back in the 60s. There was only one kind of oral medication. There's only really one medication besides insulin that could treat diabetes, and that was a class of drugs called sulfonylureas. So that's things like glyburide and other drugs like that. And what those drugs do is they help the body to make insulin. They help to stimulate the body's capacity to make insulin and to secrete the insulin. And really, they stimulate the body's capacity to secrete the insulin. And so the drug metformin is among many drugs, and sulfonylureas are still used, but metformin is actually safer. And it's often the first drug that's tried in type 2 diabetes. The problem is if you think somebody has type 2 diabetes and they really have one of these MODYs or these transcription factor types of diabetes, then they won't respond because their problem is in secreting insulin. Metformin helps you to respond to insulin. Okay. Metformin is what's known as an insulin sensitizer.
But I took you down that road because I mentioned metformin. So that's
No, that's fine though, because that's important. And that's actually ironically one of the reasons why a misdiagnosis is even more of a problem today than it was a long time ago, because it used to be that people were treated with the type of drugs that actually work with monogenic diabetes. Yeah.
Got it.
So,
okay.
But that's just one of the treatments. Now there's another whole kind of class of monogenic diabetes that doesn't actually require any treatment. And so this is due to a partial deficiency of an enzyme called glucokinase that kind of tells the pancreatic beta cells that there's glucose around, and it catalyzes a chemical reaction. So people who have that form, they actually have a lifelong mild hyperglycemia that if it doesn't have any other causes, then it's largely benign, and it actually doesn't respond very well to treatment. So knowing that you have that form, which is called glucokinase diabetes, means that you can discontinue treatment.
All right, Kristin, let me bring you on because you lived with what you thought was type 1 diabetes for a very long time. Can you tell us your story?
Yes, I was diagnosed at the age of 5 back in 1980, and I had all the classic symptoms of type 1 diabetes. As a matter of fact, when my parents didn't know what was going on with me, one of my friend's moms was a nurse, And she said, geez, yeah, I think she might have diabetes. And I ended up in the hospital, and with a very high glucose, they diagnosed me immediately with type 1, and I was put on insulin. As a matter of fact, I was put on purified pork insulin and then moved to bovine. And I stayed on insulin for the better part, for 38 years. I did move on to a pump when I turned 25, and life was just normal for me. I don't ever remember not being diabetic. And I think that was a good thing. I was so young when I was diagnosed, and I don't know what life is like not having it. And I know it was an adjustment for my family, for my siblings, because, you know, my mom made them do all the same things I did, minus the blood sugars and the insulin. But, you know, they had to eat and they had to have snacks and they had to get up early too. And it just became a norm in our house. Yeah, I went to college. I did all these great things, traveled, played sports, got married to my husband, and had 2 kids.
All right. So fast forward then. So your daughter, Ava, who is now 11, she was diagnosed with type 1 as an infant. And I imagine that was, you know, devastating, not only because you've already been through it yourself, but she was so young. She was 15 months. Right back to Kristin in just a moment. But first, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by OneDrop. OneDrop is diabetes management for the 21st century. OneDrop was designed by people with diabetes for people with diabetes. OneDrop's glucose meter looks nothing like a medical device. It's sleek, compact, and seamlessly integrates with the award-winning OneDrop mobile app. Sync all your other health apps to OneDrop to keep track of the big picture and easily see health trends. And with a OneDrop subscription, you get unlimited test strips and lancets delivered right to your door. Every OneDrop plan also includes access to your own certified diabetes coach. Have questions but don't feel like waiting for your next doctor visit? Your personal coach is always there to help. Go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the OneDrop logo. Now back to Kristin talking about her daughter's diagnosis.
15 months, she kind of had a little bit of the same classic symptoms that I had. A few things were different. And when I kind of look back on it in hindsight, there were signals kind of all along, I think. You know, she had thrush in her mouth as an infant a few times. She always had yeast infections, diaper rashes. When I look back on it, we're like, oh, maybe this was the manifestation of this. But when she was 15 months old, she was still 17 pounds. She was eating a ton of food. I mean, she would eat half of a zucchini, a whole sweet potato, half a chicken breast. You know, drink milk, eat yogurt, and then 2 hours later, we're drinking more milk, we're having more yogurt, getting up in the middle of the night. She wasn't excessively peeing all the time. You know, she didn't have frequent urination,
right.
But she was just underweight. You know, the amount of food she was eating didn't match what her weight should be. So I kind of had it in the back of my mind, well, maybe she has diabetes. She had bronchitis before she turned a year old. So we went and we got the blood work done, and her fasting glucose was not actually overly high. It was in, I think, the 200s, but she was diagnosed as type 1, and we had compounded insulin. They had to, you know, dilute her insulin because of her age and her needs. And it was devastating in the fact that this was something I never wanted her to have, you know. So there was this mother's guilt of, oh my gosh, you know, she got this from me. And that was very difficult to deal with. And, you know, not so much myself having diabetes, but now my daughter was going to have to do the same things I have to do. And her life wasn't going to be normal. And we had to say goodbye to that normalcy. It was almost like a death. You know, it was the life that we knew was now gone. And we had to readjust, and, you know, her insulin had to be on ice. It had to be cold all the time. So we were always walking around with our refrigerated bags. We have tons of ice packs.
Is it because it was diluted it had to stay cold? Oh, okay.
And in where we live, we don't have compound pharmacies, so it had to be shipped from Baltimore.
Wow.
And it's the same thing my parents went through. Just this everything's turned upside down, and calling in her blood sugars every night, 7 p.m., constantly changing insulin to carb ratios. And, she was on shots and half units. So, trying to draw half unit insulin doses. And it was overwhelming. And this is coming from me who's lived with diabetes and kind of knows more than the average person, but even still, it was a huge adjustment. It was really, really hard. It was a hard pill to swallow. Life now with 2 diabetics in the house, a lot of care went into Ava. I kind of put myself on the back burner for a little bit, trying to manage her and manage me. And it was a challenge. And being that young where she couldn't communicate with me.
Right. That's so difficult. So when in this journey then, because here we are talking to you on a podcast about monogenetic diabetes, when did you find out what she really had?
So we were at one of her just regular checkup appointments at University of Maryland Medical Center. And Ava's nurse, she had presented us with this study and asked if we wanted to participate. And I spoke on behalf of Ava and said yes. And being a biologist myself, I thought monogenic diabetes. And when Ava was diagnosed, I kept saying, how did she get type 1? Like, there is that genetic component to it. But for type 1, I think to be passed on, Dr. Pollan, you can certainly correct me if I'm misspoken here. There's a lower percentage of inheritance rate for type 1 compared, obviously, to monogenic. Right? So I kept, all the research at the time when she was diagnosed was stem cell, stem cell, stem cell. I wanted genetics, and nobody was doing genetics. And so when this opportunity came about, I was like, yeah, I want to find out more about this. I'd never heard of monogenic diabetes. And I started reading up on it, and I thought, this is what I've been looking for. This is what I want to know. So we entered Ava into the study and got our blood work done and just waited for our results.
And how old was she at the time?
She just turned 9.
Oh, so this has been going on for a very long time. This is her whole childhood.
Yeah.
Tony, let me ask you, I don't understand. How do you live with what you think is type 1 and it's really something else? I mean, is it dangerous to be on an insulin pump? Is it dangerous to be treated like a type 1 when you actually have something else?
Well, in some cases, it's not necessarily acutely dangerous, because the problem in all diabetes is a problem with blood sugar. And in certain types of monogenic diabetes, it's because you're not producing enough insulin. You can treat it with insulin and that'll be okay. But there's a couple reasons why it would be preferable not to do that. And one would be, of course, as I think Kristin and Ava will be able to tell you better than I can, that most people seem to prefer taking a pill to wearing a pump or doing injections. But the other thing is that when you think about, just think about anything that you have wrong with you. It's almost like, you can put a Band-Aid, you can kind of treat it superficially, or you can treat it in a kind of deeper way. You can treat the underlying problem. Sometimes, not everybody, but for some people, they might be fine on insulin, as Ava and Kristin were, but you might be able to be even better if you're treating the underlying problem.
All right, so let's go back, Kristin. Ava's 9, you get the results. Were you both in the study, or did Ava get the results and then they said, hey, Mom, we better check you too?
Well, when the study was first presented, I said, hey, can I get in on this? And they said, only if Ava's positive, only if she presents a mutation. So she had her blood work done in May, and we got the official diagnosis on December 5th. And I always get choked up talking about that phone call, because it really was a phone call that was the answers to a new life. And it was probably the first time that I was speechless on the phone with Dr. Streeton, who had called me with the results. And the fact that this meant there was a possibility to not be on insulin was just amazing. When we were going through this study, we never really presented much to Ava, because we didn't want to give false hope. We didn't want to build something up that may or may not be. When we were going through this, we just said, well, we're going to see if your diabetes can be treated differently. When we got the news that she had KATP diabetes, also known as MODY 13, this is one of the forms where you can take a sulfonylurea instead of insulin. But that's, it's a 90% success rate, a 10% failure rate. So that was something that we didn't want to, once again, get our hopes up with her. So we were very cautious with how we proceeded through this whole thing. The news of her having this mutation was amazing. It was probably one of the greatest days of my life. And then that meant, hey, I get in the study too. So I was really happy about that as well. Ava came off of insulin within 2 weeks of taking the glyburide, the sulfonylurea, but it wasn't an easy process. It wasn't like just start taking a pill and come off insulin. You have to wean yourself off of it. She had a difficult time. She was low most of the time, like in the 30s. It would take hours to come up. I've had to leave work and pick her up at school, and then at night she'd be 400, and it was kind of like being in that first diagnosis stage all over again with CGMs going off, and we got her regulated, and she's great. Her A1C was just recently 6.2. I'm sorry, 6.9. She corrected me. Oh, I'm sorry, 5.9. She recorrected me.
All right. Okay.
So her A1C was 5.9. Yeah. She responded immediately to it, A1C wise. She was down within 2 weeks of coming off of insulin. Her A1C was down into the under 7.
Right. And this 5.9 is now, 2 years later?
Yeah, almost 2 years. Yeah.
And what happened with you? When did you get that phone call? What was that like?
I got a call from Dr. Streeton in February. I think it was right around Valentine's Day. And, she called and told me that I had the same mutation. And it was, once again, it's like hitting the lottery. It was just something I couldn't believe I was hearing, and of course, the emotions come into play with it. And I thought when she was diagnosed with diabetes, I felt incredibly guilty that I had passed this disease on to her. And now when I look at it, I am so happy that if I passed anything on to her disease-wise, thank goodness it was this, because she could still be on insulin. I could still be on insulin, and we're off. And it took me about a month to come off of insulin. I had a couple things working against me in this process. First off was my age. I was in my 40s. So I think the oldest documented patient in literature was about 36.
Oh.
So there's quite a bit of an age difference there. And plus I had I was on insulin for 38 years compared to another documented case, I think, where it was significantly less. So that 90% success, 10% failure was pretty heavy for me because I wasn't necessarily responding to the medication as quickly as Ava did. I was kind of not having any lows. And I think finally, when I had my first low, I think I was in my classroom teaching, and my students were like, what's wrong? And I said, my blood sugar's low. And they're like, oh, what do we do? I go, nothing. This is great. I celebrated with them because my students had kind of followed me, and Ava kind of through this process. And I was like, no, I need this to be low. And then it took me about a month. I came off of insulin officially. I think it was April 28th is when I came off of insulin, and I just had my A1C done, and I'm 6.5 right now. And I take my glyburide twice a day. Ava takes it 3 times. I know that my endocrinologist at Hopkins was shocked that I had a form of monogenic, and he's pretty keen on picking up things like that. But he said with my particular mutation, the KATP, the KCNJ11 gene, it mimics type 1. And it's harder to identify a KCNJ11 or a KATP diabetic compared to that of a type 1, because they do mimic each other.
Let me stop you just for a second. Tony, I have so many questions. I think, my first reaction as a mom of a kid with type 1, it goes back to those first days where we're all thinking, couldn't this be something else? Isn't there another possibility? And I remember I found MODY. And I found other types of diabetes, and I asked my endocrinologist, and he said, Stacey, I really wish that he could just take a pill, but this is type 1 diabetes. So am I now supposed to go back, or all the parents and individuals with type 1 listening to the podcast, what are we supposed to do? Should we go back and demand these tests?
So this is the really hard thing. So a couple of things. One of the things that I do worry about and kind of want to temper is that, of course, most people with a diagnosis of type 1 diabetes actually have type 1 diabetes. And the study that Ava and then Kristin were in, the purpose of that study was really to find a realistic way to make sure, not that necessarily every person with diabetes gets tested, but that every person with diabetes gets considered as a possible candidate based on certain red flags that clue you in. So there is more overlap, I think, than people realize in how people with different types of diabetes present. And there was a study done. I sort of always knew this anecdotally. I come at this from kind of a unique perspective. I trained as a genetic counselor and then went and did research and did a PhD studying the genetics of type 2 diabetes. And I realized that we had a lot of things we were promising about what would happen when we understood the genetics of type 2 diabetes, and realizing that actually with some of these monogenic forms, if we could just find the patients, we could already make a difference in their lives. And so I began to realize that it just often wasn't considered, or it was considered so rare as almost not to exist. And then in 2012, there was actually a study published that was a study called the SEARCH study, where they were trying to find all the diabetes, what caused diabetes in a whole bunch of children at different centers in the country. And they found that, at least 80% of the time or more, monogenic diabetes, or specifically MODY, is misdiagnosed as either type 1 diabetes or type 2 diabetes. It can be mistaken. There are clues that you can look for. So how did Ava and Kristin end up in our study when, their own doctor didn't suspect them? So one of my team members, I happen to have on my team, I'm not sure, she may be the only physician who's double board certified in both endocrinology and medical genetics. And as one of our strategies, we had several strategies for identifying patients and trying to find ways of identifying patients in medical systems. One was using questionnaires to have simple questions for the red flags I'm about to tell you, and also getting referrals. But also she started to actually look up in the charts of patients who were coming for treatment for their next appointment to look for these red flags. So one of the red flags we were looking for was children who were diagnosed before the age of 12 months. Because we actually know that if you're diagnosed before the age of 6 months, which is very, very rare, the overwhelming majority of those cases are monogenic and not type 1. Right. It gets more and more likely to be type 1 as they get older, but the sort of gray zone, one of the things we were looking for was any children diagnosed before 12 months. Well, Dr. Streeton saw that Ava was coming in, she was diagnosed at 15 months. And it was kind of, isn't that, that's pretty young. That's kind of borderline. You sort of, the line kind of creeps up because you want to make sure you don't miss anybody. Then when we realized too that, as Kristin pointed out, that her mother also had type 1 diabetes, even though it was diagnosed at a little older age, that raised the suspicion. So that's actually one of the things they look for, is when you see type 1 being transmitted from generation to generation. It happens, and there's definitely an increased risk in children. But if it's monogenic, then the risk is more like 50%. So those are one of the things. What's really important is that if it's type 1 diabetes, usually, not always, but usually there are antibodies that indicate the autoimmune process that says that the beta cells are going away, they're being destroyed by the immune system. But if you have especially the right antibody tests and you don't have those antibodies, that's a red flag. It could still be type 1 diabetes, but when you get antibodies tested and you don't have them, then it raises the chance. The other thing is that the longer the C-peptide persists, that also raises the suspicion, because, C-peptide is a measure of whether the pancreas is actually producing insulin, which you can measure even if a person is taking insulin injections. because it's the kind of byproduct of insulin that's produced by the body. Those are the kinds of things they look for. Sometimes we also look for people, this has a really good likelihood of picking people up, people who are diagnosed with diabetes, but it's not type 1 diabetes. Like it's known not to be type 1 diabetes. And it says, we might see some diagnosed with type 2 diabetes at 25, especially if this person is not overweight, not obese. So there's just these sort of atypical situations that raise the suspicion. So, there's these characteristics, and it turned out that was our best characteristic for picking people up diagnosed with non-type 2 diabetes, and then non-type 1. Then we confirmed it by looking at the antibodies and C-peptide. We then got hits as just, if you think about a physician who sees thousands of patients with diabetes, they're going to start to kind of notice, like, this one really looks atypical. So people start, just noticing something atypical, and sometimes it didn't always fit with the exact characteristics that we were looking for, but it almost fit, and it sounded like it could be. It sounded like, basically this is, a child who maybe doesn't really need insulin. I mean, there are cases published. There's an actual case report published of adolescent rebellion leads to diagnosis of monogenic diabetes because a teenager just decided to stop using his insulin and was fine. And so they suspected. So I think earlier when you asked about, what's the consequence of being on insulin when you don't need to be, I thought you might also ask, why is this? Why are so many people, not correctly diagnosed? And that's it, that there's some people not knowing about it, but then even if people know about it, then there's a lot of overlap. But there are these things you can do. There's a way you can put out links, but we've started to develop resources to help both patients and providers to start to think about it. And there's a website at the University of Exeter where they have a calculator where you just put in really basic information like HbA1c and whether you have a parent with diabetes. And it actually gives you, based on their own database, the percent chance that someone, might have a mutation in one of these genes. But, as you can hear, no matter what you do, it's just not always straightforward. And that's what we'd like it to be.
And this may sound very ignorant, so pardon me, I can't wrap my brain around the fact that we're all supposed to be so careful with insulin, right? And people are terrified to give too much. And yet you got 4% of people with diabetes who don't need insulin necessarily, who are taking it every day and not having these terrible adverse effects. I guess my question is, I'm almost more confused. So not everybody is supposed to get genetic testing, but you could be taking 40 units of insulin a day and have monogenetic diabetes, not need the insulin, and not know it.
Right. So when I say not everybody should get genetic testing, I should probably rephrase that. If there were a way, and I believe there will be in the future, for everybody to have genetic testing, then it would make sense.
Got it.
People, if probably a lot of your listeners or, podcast listeners are probably listen to some of these genomics podcasts. And, we're now at the point where more and more people have their whole genome sequenced. In many of our kind of visions of, what does genomic medicine look like? People often talk about, I want to have genetic testing to see what I'm at risk for, or I want to have my genome sequence to see what I'm at risk for. But what I see is in the future, when everybody has access to their genomic data, then it could just become a very routine thing where, you get to diagnose with diabetes and they run a bunch of tests, because forgetting about MODY, there's still tests to run to figure out what kind of diabetes you have. If you're kind of on the border, if you're 29 years old, you're a candidate for type 2, you're a candidate for type 1, especially if you're overweight, and some of these other risk factors. So in my dream, everybody has very ready access to their genomic data. And so if somebody's diagnosed with diabetes, then you'll be able to run an algorithm that will pull up whether there are variants in any of these genes. It's just that we're not there yet, and there's still costs associated with doing genetic testing. So what we are needing to do right now, kind of till we wait till the genome era, is that we really need to pay attention. I think a lot of what we need to do is we need to, I think stories are the key. So that's why I was so excited to come on here with Kristin and Ava, because I think that every story is different. And I got interested in this for the reasons I said, that I realized that there was a way that genetics could be used to help. A lot of what I knew was just from reading journal articles. But as I got started, got funding for research and started doing the research and started talking to patients, I kept learning more and more nuances. And so I think one of the keys is just finding out. I think there's a whole lot to this that we don't know because we don't know the full extent of the patient lived experience. But when we do, that will help us to help other people.
I would have never known I was a monogenic diabetic had it not been for Ava. Because my parents don't have diabetes. There is zero history of diabetes in my family. So if it weren't for Ava having diabetes, I would still be on an insulin pump and I would still be taking insulin and probably spend the rest of my life on insulin. So I'm very grateful, of course, to my daughter for having diabetes. It's a weird thing for a parent to say. But when you look at, the scope of kind of what's happened in our life and how we went from functionally a pancreas, that's because that's what our life had changed to. We kind of stopped being human and we started being an organ. And there's not too many chronic diseases out there where you actually have to do the job of the organ that isn't working. And that's what diabetes is. I mean, you become your pancreas, with manipulating the pump and the shots and everything. So to go from being a pancreas now to being a person again, it's a pretty amazing thing. But once again, my physician thought I was type 1 the whole time. So if it weren't for Ava being in the study, this would not be my life today of being insulin-free and on medication. Hopefully at some point, people will have access to their genome to identify things like this so that, another person doesn't spend 38 years of their life taking insulin when they don't need to.
You're listening to Diabetes Connections with Stacey Simms.
Much more to come. We will continue with our talk. The second half of the interview is coming up, including my chat with Ava, Kristin's daughter. And I want to let you know that if you're thinking, what are my chances, what are my child's chances of actually having monogenetic diabetes, there's a short quiz you can take to see if it is worth talking to your doctor about this. And I am going to link that up on the episode homepage. It's just a couple of questions. I took it and really doesn't seem like it is worth it to talk to our doctor, but you can take it for yourself and find out more. Diabetes Connections is also brought to you by Dexcom. And, we started with Dexcom back in the olden days before Share. So trust me when I say using the Share and Follow apps makes a big difference. And I'll tell you how long ago we started. We were cleaning out some things and Benny came running into my room and he's like, remember this? And it was the Share cradle. That's what, for you new people, that's the only way we could share for a little while was plugging the Dexcom receiver into the Share cradle. But, it makes such a big difference when you can see those numbers, right? And you have to set parameters, at least we do, about when I'm going to call him, how long to wait, not to overreact to everything. It really helps us talk and worry about diabetes less. If he's at a sleepover or away on a trip, it gives me so much peace of mind. And I really like that I can troubleshoot with him because we can see what's been happening over the last 24 hours and not just at one moment. Internet connectivity is required to access the separate Dexcom Follow app. To learn more, go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Dexcom logo. Time for Tell Me Something Good. And I got a great message via Facebook from Christina. And she writes, I have a good news story for you. My older daughter, Natasha, who is 24, has been a great help to her younger sister, Rose, 6. Rose was diagnosed 3 years ago, and Natasha has been there for everything. The hospital stay, the classes, and everything in between. She is busy with her own life, but always had time for us and her little sister. Because of her sister, who has type 1, and her brother, who has Crohn's, she is getting her master's degree to become a dietitian. Christina, thank you so much for sharing that. Thank you for the great picture that we will share on social media. We know that any chronic condition is tough on the family, and it's tough on the siblings who don't have it, right? Because everybody's life is affected. It is hard stuff to go through and make those siblings feel included. They get so much empathy and understanding, but can be a lot of resentment and normal bad feelings too. I think it's important to acknowledge that. So I really appreciate you sharing this, and all the best to Natasha as she goes forward in her studies. Keep us posted. And Christina also added, and I'll put this in even though it's very self-promotional, but Christina added that I want to tell you how much I appreciate you and your podcast. So many times I feel like I'm living in my own world with this crazy diabetes. I listen and I instantly feel better. Thanks. Keep up the great work. Well, Christina, you just made my day. Thank you so much for that. You know, I got to tell you, it's so selfish to do this podcast because I do it and I instantly feel better. It's really just a nice way for me to be connected to the community. It really is not a one-way street here. So thank you for that very, very nice note. All right, let's get back to our talk on monogenetic diabetes. This is the second half of the interview, and we're going to pick up here with a few words from Ava, who was initially diagnosed as a baby, but a study found that at the age of 9, she didn't have type 1 at all. And I want to let you know here, she talks about her insulin pump and her elementary school experience. And while everyone is different, you'll understand in a moment why I'm saying this, but this did not match our experience at all. And I think it's really important, especially if you are newer to an insulin pump or considering one for you or your child, that if your child is being excluded or cannot do certain activities with an insulin pump or is being told they cannot, the staff at that school needs better education. And it's a great idea to talk to your educator or your endocrinologist or even your pump rep to say, my child can't do this with this pump. How do we work around it? Because as you know, if you listen, having a pump since age 2, a tubed pump since age 2, never stopped my kid from doing anything. All right, so let's pick it back up. And here I am talking to Ava. When your parents told you that you actually didn't have type 1, but you had something else, do you remember what you thought about that?
I thought that it was worse because my mom just told me that I didn't have type 1, so I thought that it was a lot worse.
And then they explained that it was just going to be different, and did you feel better about it pretty quickly?
Yeah. It took like an hour before they told me that I could come off of insulin.
Do you remember, so it's been about 2 years, I'm curious if you remember what it was like to take insulin and wear an insulin pump.
I had to change my site every 3 days, and when I had to wear the pump, I had a cord, and it got stuck on things, and I couldn't do much physical activity. Well, I could, but like I couldn't do certain things in gym because it would pull off the like little hatch that connected onto my catheter, or my pump would fall out and it would disconnect that way. So I couldn't do many things that other kids got to do, so I was just kind of like left out and sitting on the wall in gym.
Oh, well that stinks. Tell me what you do now. You don't wear an insulin pump. You take a pill a couple of times a day?
Yeah, I take a pill 3 times a day. And it's mainly the same except for the fact that I can do more things that I couldn't do. I can go swimming without a pump. I can just food without needing to have my mom come get the card, calculate it to insulin, and I need to put it into my pump. Do you and your mom talk about what it was like before? Because, she thought she had type 1 also. Yeah. I don't normally talk about it. No one really brings it up. But if someone brings it up and asks me, like, how it was before I came off insulin, I don't really like to talk about it, but I can still explain how life was before glyburide.
Do you mind me asking why you don't like to talk about it? It's okay if you don't even want to answer that.
It just brings back a lot of, bad memories because I couldn't do a lot of stuff in elementary school. Like, when I was in, 3rd or 4th grade, that's when I could finally come off. But when I was in kindergarten through about 3rd or 4th grade, I couldn't really do the, rock wall. I couldn't do many, it was hard to do a play that I was in because I had a microphone because I was a lead, and my sight tube, my pump, it always got tangled onto the microphone, so we had to readjust it regularly.
Have you sat down and talked to each other about how extraordinary this all is? Because it's hard, I think, when you're the people in it to see that.
Yeah. Well, when we were presented with the study option and I told her like, oh, we have to go and we have to get blood drawn. She was like, no, I don't want to do that. And I go, but you have to understand, not only can this help us, but, it can help other people. And really when we started getting involved with Dr. Poland through MedRap and going to the Friends for Life conference, that I told Ava that, what we're doing is helping other people. We're giving other people the potential opportunity to experience life without insulin. And that's the beauty of medical research. And I've done a lot of different and participated in a lot of different research studies where, we kind of get to see the outcome of that. And there's an intrinsic value to doing things like this and to talking about it. She tends not to talk about it as much as I do. But yeah, like we've talked about, why we're doing this and, why we're doing the podcast and why we went to Florida. That was one of the most fantastic diabetes conferences I've ever been to. And why we're sharing our stories, because there's other people out there like us. And, she's 11 and, and she's in her little 11-year-old world. And I'm not sure she really kind of sees, the outcomes of what we're doing. I don't think she's going to really realize that until she's a little bit older to see, wow, there's people in my high school that have monogenic diabetes. I think as she begins to meet other people that have a form of monogenic, when I was diagnosed with type 1, I was the only person in my town. And I was one of only like 9 kids in northeastern Pennsylvania with type 1 diabetes. So talk about being kind of your own being in a community. Everyone knew I was diabetic. At the age that I'm at now, and I'm a teacher, every year I have the diabetic kids. They put them in my class. I think it's intentional. Other diabetics put them with Skiados. And Ava's got a couple of kids in her class that are type 1. And so you kind of feel that you're not alone, that you're not just this person with this one illness that, doctors, can treat, but it's hard to manage. And I think that as we're moving forward with the research that Dr. Poland has done, that there's going to be a shift where Ava's not going to be the only monogenic diabetic patient or kid in her school or in our county, or in Southern Maryland as a whole. Hopefully we'll see there's more kids out there that have been re-diagnosed with a form of monogenic. So we talk about it in terms of the value of it, but I think for an 11-year-old, it's a little bit harder to grasp the big picture when you're still the only kid in your school that's monogenic. She's not the only diabetic kid, but she's the only monogenic kid. When she started middle school, we had to have a meeting with the administrative team and the nursing supervisor because they didn't know any of this stuff.
Well, wait, and let me jump in because I know we're getting really long on this interview, guys, but I may have misunderstood. So she takes a pill 3 times a day, but does she have to do anything else? Are you still checking blood sugar and worried about highs and lows?
So, yeah, we still do worry about her highs and lows. But, if she's high, it will come back down. When she's low, yeah, we still have to treat it, 15 grams of carb. We still have that protocol. She wears a CGM most of the time. So she really just kind of checks in with her nurse, and she has to take her glyburide at lunchtime. So she visits the nurse there. But, when you're dealing with something that's not the norm, people get a little bit nervous with it.
All right. Before I let you go, and Tony, let me ask you to weigh in on this one more time. I just keep coming back to, what do we do? I know that in the future, hopefully we can get more testing, but is it a question now of, okay, my son was, let's use me. My son was diagnosed at 23 months. He looks like a classic type 1 diabetes. No one in our family had diabetes before him. I don't recall, not needing insulin at any way, shape, or form. In fact, he's had that classic journey of teeny tiny doses. I remember drawing up those quarter units in a syringe. We couldn't see it at all when he was 23 months. And then the basal rates doubling and then doubling again as he hit puberty. So I think we're probably not a good candidate to be tested for this, right?
It certainly sounds like classic type 1. I should do my kind of disclaimer now that I'm not a physician. But, I think part of the problem is that we still don't know what we don't know, which is why what we were telling people, when we've been to Kristin and Ava and I were mentioned in Florida. Kristin and I went to the Friends for Life conference more recently in Falls Church, and just the importance of getting those antibodies and the C-peptide, because, I think it's becoming more routine to get them, but just because it's possible and even the C-peptide, it's possible to not show any C-peptide in the blood, because this particular type, so the type that Kristin and Ava have is actually different than the main types they talked about, where, the insulin gets made, but there's this channel that doesn't function properly. And so the insulin can't get out. So I'd say look for the atypical cases, but if you have any doubts, if you're curious, at least make sure you've kind of had these kind of baseline measures that make it clear that this really is type 1 diabetes, because we don't know every possible scenario that this can present as. I also did want to say, because I wanted to kind of correct something a little bit. You were asking earlier, is there harm to being on insulin when you don't need it? I can tell you that this KATP diabetes, this potassium channel diabetes, it's most common in, really little infants, like we're talking like 0 to 6 months. And I've heard some of those parents, for example, there's a little girl in Chicago who's actually in a movie called Journey to a Miracle. If it's an educational resource. And I've seen her parents speak and talk about how she would have hypoglycemic seizures, because it was very difficult to control her glucose with insulin, especially when she couldn't verbalize what was going on inside. What really struck me, I went to actually the premiere of the movie they made when they showed it in Chicago, and actually I think this movie is available on Amazon. So if people want to see it, it tells some of the story. But what really struck me was many of these parents saw this as a cure, which kind of surprised me, because I thought, we don't have a cure, but it's better. But to them, it felt like going from a kid with really difficult to control type 1 diabetes to, manageable, mild type 2 diabetes. Like, the other thing this is kind of really bringing up a whole nother subject, but some of the kids who have these mutations, it actually it has neurological function. It actually affect some of their brain function, and some of that can improve with the treatment as well. So that's just kind of extra, but kind of getting, back to your question of what do we do? This is what's keeps me up at night sometimes, but it's keeping me in research. This is what my research is really trying to do. How do we address all these barriers? I mean, we've talked about some of the barriers. Genetic testing can still be expensive. We need to communicate to insurance companies what the genetic testing does and how it's useful. We need to communicate to providers worldwide. When we do the genetic testing, we need to improve the genetic testing so that we're better at telling the difference between which variations in the gene actually cause diabetes. And so one of the other initiatives that I have a worldwide panel of experts in monogenic diabetes that can pool together not only their knowledge, but they can pool together their cases. So to give an example, the mutation that Ava has was only reported one time in the literature. And because it was reported in the literature, we were able to say that it was an important mutation in this disease. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been able to. And so the solution really is communication. That's why we're here on this podcast, and people telling their stories, working together, being open, and finding more people so that other people can help come up with other creative ways. So,
wow. Well, Tony and Kristin and Ava, thank you all so much for sharing this story, for giving us all of this information, and for continuing the research. I mean, it's incredible to think about how many people might be walking around with a misdiagnosis. So thanks for coming on. I appreciate your time so much, and, keep us posted. So how about that? Isn't it difficult to think about being misdiagnosed and not having type 1 diabetes? I mean, as Kristin said, it really is a dream. It would be so nice to be able to tell my son, oh, sorry, you don't need to take insulin anymore. There were times during this interview where I kind of felt myself I got jealous. I got a little angry. I got resentful. I was very happy for them. I'm happy for any family that turns this situation around. Although it doesn't sound like monogenetic diabetes is a walk in the park either. I mean, let's be honest. But I had to let myself feel all those feelings as we were talking. And if you felt them too, you're definitely not alone. Okay, next stop on the World's Worst Diabetes Mom book tour. I'm heading to South Portland, Maine this weekend. Oh, it is going to be so much colder. I'm so nervous being the Southern transplant that I am. It's going to be great. I'm talking to a group called the Maine Peapods, parents and providers of diabetic children. And I am thrilled to be going up there. So excited to talk to this group and meet everybody. We're going to have a great weekend. If you'd like me to come speak to you, definitely reach out. There's a page at diabetes-connections.com called Community. It's got our schedule, where we're going, where we've been, and what you need to do to request an appearance from me. I can come out and do the podcast. I can come out and do what I'm doing this weekend, which is the World's Worst Diabetes Mom presentation, which is all about why you all should be more worst. And why making mistakes is a really, really great idea. We have a lot of fun. Thank you, as always, to my editor, John Buchanan from Audio Editing Solutions. Thank you so much for listening. Our mini episode is going to come along in just a couple of days. Those are airing every Thursday, so I hope you can join us for that. I'm Stacey Simms, and I'll see you back here on Thursday.
Diabetes Connections is a production of Stacey Simms Media. All rights reserved, all wrongs avenged.